Welcome back to How China Works. I'm Brendan Davis. My co-host Ying Li will be with us in just a minute. Our guest this week is Mr. Huang Hongxiang, and he is the founder of China House. They are a nonprofit that focuses on sending Chinese youth, especially to the global south, as he puts it, to Africa and Latin America, to help with bridge building, cooperation with projects. And what they are doing is very, very special. We are going to have a wonderful talk with him coming up. After this very brief introduction, I want to say two things. First of all, the introduction is brief because, interestingly, my power is out. So I'm recording this while I still have some power in the laptop, and I can output it and upload this through my phone, hopefully. So if you're actually hearing this, I was either successful or the power came back on. I have uploaded through the phone before. It's always quite an adventure. The other piece of news is that Ying and I had a great time a couple of weeks ago with our first How China Works live event, which was at the Bookworm Cafe. It featured Fuhan with special guest Mark Levine. We have our second How China Works Live coming up very soon. I'm very happy to announce this right now. How China Works Live is coming back to Beijing September 17th. We will be recording a very special show that we are subtitling How China Laughs, and our guest is Jesse Appel. Jesse is one of the leading comedians working in China. He has an amazing story, and we will be doing that show at his space, the U.S.-China Comedy Center, which is over in the Hutongs, north of Nandogushang. And all that information will be coming out via our channel. We'll be posting about this on our social media accounts this coming week. But if you're in Beijing September 17th, please come join us for this taping. We'll talk about Western-style stand-up comedy and improv. We'll talk about Chinese crosstalk comedy. And we'll talk about Jesse's work in integrating all of these into something that's really unique and special and quite awesome and entertaining, if I do say so myself. So please come join us if you can and enjoy that show when you hear it later. For now, though, please enjoy our interview with Mr. Huang Hongxiang. Well, we are very glad to be here with our guest, Mr. Huang Hongxiang. How badly did I mangle your name?
No, your pronunciation is quite good.
I appreciate your courtesy. And of course, Ying Li.
Hi,
how
everyone.
are you, Ying?
Great. And Hongxiang, we're looking forward to talking to you for long. So excited.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We're really glad to have you, and we traditionally start off by asking you to please give us the short introduction to yourself, people you would like to know you a bit better.
So my name is Huang Hongxiang, or you can just call me Hong, like Hong Kong without Kong. That's easier to remember.
I'll be doing that.
And what we do is essentially I'm the founder of a social enterprise called China House. What we do is we send young Chinese people to the global south, like Africa, Latin America, to do research and projects related to sustainable development. And through doing so, we wish to construct a bridge between China and the world.
That's exactly what we're doing. Fantastic.
Only we haven't gone to Africa together yet. Let me ask one quick question. Ying has so many great ones. You are a relatively young man. When did you develop this interest in this perspective? How did that sort of come about for you?
So when I was very young, like in primary school, I already had a dream of going to the Amazon rainforest or going to Africa's savannah and so on. But when I was very young, like everyone around me told me that's impossible. They are far away, they're dangerous and so on and so on. So that's what I thought it would be. But then in 2011, I finished my undergrad from Fudan University Journalism School, and then I went to Columbia University for my master degree at International Development. And one day, somehow I had a conversation with my friend from Ecuador, and she was telling me that, Hong, do you know in my country we have so many Chinese people. They are here eating our wildlife, destroying our environment. Our president has almost sold my country to you, China. I was like, what? Where is Ecuador? So I got very interested. How come in a country that I have never even heard of, there will be so many Chinese people, and what would they be doing there? So at the end of 2011, I flew alone to Ecuador from New York, and then I spent about 10 days there doing a research to understand how Chinese companies have been doing there in Ecuador and what is their impact to local sustainable development. And then I realized, wow, today in places that are so far away from China, even like Latin America, there are so many Chinese there doing everything, building roads, running restaurants, building hydropower, doing oil, mining, extraction, and so on. While on one hand, we see a lot of economic development is related to China's contribution there, we also have a lot of issues with social and environmental conflicts. So I interview a lot of NGOs there, Chinese companies there, scholars, media journalists, and so on. And then I wrote an article to talk about Chinese companies overseas and their social responsibility. I published that on a Chinese newspaper called Southern Weekly, 南方周末. And then, from then on, I got really interested into this topic. And then I went to Peru to study Chinese companies' labor conflicts there. I went to Brazil to study Chinese mining companies there and the local integration. And in 2013, I went to South Africa. And then I spent 3 months in Africa studying the illegal wildlife trade and the Chinese connection.
Like, what made you interested in that kind of particular project?
Well, since animals. I was very young, I'm already like an environmentalist and an animal lover. So I always wished to do something for it. And that is exactly why at the beginning I would get interested to go to Ecuador. Because the first reaction I had when I heard about these Chinese companies influencing local rainforests, my first reaction is not really from a Chinese person perspective, but from like a human perspective.
Yeah, like a global view on this.
I do not wish the rainforest to be destroyed, especially not from my own people. So as a Chinese, I wish to understand and see whether there's anything I can do to help the rainforest.
And it's interesting, as we record this, so this will come out in a couple of weeks, but as we record it, unfortunately, the Amazon rainforest is on fire, and it's going to be really, hopefully they can get that put out pretty soon.
Yeah. So when you know, of course, we heard a lot of amazing stories that you are out there in different countries, different world, doing all kinds of these kind of projects, social enterprise project. But were you feeling fearful at the time? Like when you started to go everywhere, like your family and friends at the time, like what prompted you actually to be able to do that one by one? Like because you were sharing with us a lot of this, but what were you fearful at the time?
Well, I totally can understand people may feel a bit dangerous and uncertain when they are going to some places they have never been to and maybe have never heard about it. But for me, I always feel like it's important that whether doing one thing is dangerous or whether it's difficult, but I think it's more important that like to consider the importance of doing something. And for me, going out to understand the outside world that I have not understood is very important for me.
Since when did you start to have this kind of enlightenment or this confirmation or confidence or determination?
I never had any confidence or determination, but when I heard about the situation in Ecuador, I just wished to go. That's it. Very simple.
Yeah. So it was the curiosity that we discovered in some detail about being interested to learn more. Yeah.
Right. I found the one interesting line with China House, right? You make 中南屋 China House. One of the mission is to integrate China into global sustainable development. Like, can you tell us a little bit more about what do you actually mean?
Well, what I mean is that today China is now everywhere in the world. There's like no matter in any kind of countries that you have never heard about in the like Asia Pacific or Latin America or Africa, everywhere you see a lot of Chinese people and everywhere you see a lot of Chinese projects. Therefore, like as someone whose master degree is in international development, I would say nowadays you cannot talk about sustainable development of any single country in this world without talking about the influence from China. But while there are positive influence as well, there are also not so positive influence as well. There are social issues, there are labor conflicts, there are community conflicts, there are environmental pollution, there are Chinese people buying and eating wildlife and so on. So I feel like today, when we are in the era of like China's going global, or we say One Belt One Road, and if we do not find a way for China to be better integrated into the global south, into the sustainable development, there will be more and more conflicts between China and the outside. And therefore, like, the local people may have a lot of negative impression about China. And this would eventually influence China's development there as well for Chinese companies and Chinese people and China as a state.
Share a story with us about this when this conflict happened in those areas where the initiative of One Belt One Road is implemented, and what are typical conflicts might arise.
Yeah, well, that was my question, is what are sort of some of the, if you can be specific, that's great. Yeah. Or if you have to make it more general to avoid people losing face or getting in trouble. No, but if you could give us a list of some of those common things.
Well, I can use the very first example that I ran into, like in Ecuador back in 2011. So at that time, a Chinese mining company was going to open the first open pit copper mining in Ecuador. And for Chinese companies, they believe first they are invited to be there from the local government.
Right.
And they believe what they are doing is to help local people. Because with this, they are going to have economic development.
They see jobs and they think sharing the resources, the benefits, and
then there could be roads, hospitals, schools, and so on. But in the eyes of many local environmental NGOs, indigenous groups, and so on, they believe this project is going to destroy the environment. It's going to hurt the local communities with their livelihood, and all the benefit is going to be taken away by central government and foreigners.
Right.
So the NGOs, they wish to communicate with the Chinese companies to understand more about this project, but they got no response. And why is that? I interviewed the Chinese companies and they told me, NGO, what is NGO? Non-governmental organizations. Are they anti-governmental organizations? Why we should be talking with them? And also,
they misunderstood the context of
they do not understand. They are not familiar with what is NGO, and they are even not familiar with what is behind that, because they are having a feeling that, well, we're here like from invitation of the government. If you local people, you have any issues, talk to your government. Yeah. There's no point of us engaging you. But that may be the case in China, but it may not be the case internationally.
Right.
So at the end, what the NGOs decided to do is they organized something called Occupy Chinese Embassy. They pretended to be applying for Chinese visa. They went to the Chinese embassy and then they rushed into the Chinese embassy and locked the door and start screaming outside there and so on with a big poster and so on. And through that, what they wish to do, as they told me, is to raise attention internationally for people to pay more attention to this case. And they feel like that's the only way to make a noise and to help them.
Well, something that, and from some of my other interests, it's not what I do professionally, but, and I have friends who are very much involved. I mean, sustainable development is one thing, but reclaiming natural, like letting natural landscapes be natural, and especially in a lot of these countries you're mentioning, the environment is seen as actually, like New Zealand, the environment has personhood. It has rights as a person, right? Rivers and mountains are seen as an entity. It's not just some resource to be mined and have things extracted for money. And a lot of these places you just ticked off your list have similar cultural traditions. So speaking of cultures clashing, have you found that you're doing a lot of educating back and forth?
Yeah.
You know, talking to the local folks who are only thinking business versus understanding the nature of the environment?
So that's totally related. So Ecuador is actually the first country to put nature's right into the constitution. But when Chinese companies and Chinese people are there, we easily come from a mindset in China with something that we believe is universal. Economic development is the most important thing in this world. That may be like, I feel like many Chinese people believe that is the case. Economic development is most important than everything. But according to my interaction with the outside world, that may not be true for many of the local people. For many local people, environmental protection may be as important or even more important.
There's a balance. It's not a
economic development.
There's no single one right answer.
Yeah, and that's why we feel like that what we have been trying to do is to try to help more Chinese people to have more global perspective, to understand that what they believe may not be true for many people outside China.
That's an important point. We again, my co-host is a fan of trying to build those bridges. And the reality is sometimes the bridges don't connect on the opposite side.
That's exactly what I mean. And building bridges, in one hand, is helping the other side, like outside the world, understand China, but also you have to build a bridge from this side as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The two sides have to be willing to be closer to each other and compromise from time to time.
Yeah, and that's why like when we are helping the Chinese companies understand who are the NGOs and what are they thinking, we also try to help the NGOs understand China better. Like who are the Chinese people, why are they here, what's their relationship between like government and companies, between the state and individuals, like and how to better engage China and interact with Chinese people. That's what we will try to share with the outside.
Yeah, from our understanding that your project involved a lot of taking Chinese students abroad, right? So in one side, we are taking the Chinese young people, right? They're ready and eager to go global. From another side, outside of China, you have to engage with a lot of stakeholders, a lot of local organizations.
Yes.
So how is the engagement look like when you actually bring them? There was different generation, different cultural background, and even different, different understanding about how things could be processed, right?
Yeah. So actually, what I would see this way. So I feel like there's a huge gap between the Chinese and the outside world right now. And when I mean Chinese, I'm even talking about Chinese people who are living outside. They may be living and working in foreign country for many years. It doesn't mean they do not have a gap between them and outside. And the reason why we had decided to focus on sending young Chinese out is that I somehow believe there need to be a middle bridge between the Chinese and the world. And young Chinese people with international education and international background, they are the people that I believe could be the bridge. Because on one hand, they speak Chinese, they understand some Chinese culture, they can talk to Chinese communities when they are in Africa, when they are in Latin America. On the other hand, they speak English, they're more open-minded, so they can talk to NGOs, media, and so on. So they can really be the ones to create this conversation.
And do you feel like the natural advantages of youth and the fact that they're coming from a more open world and they're probably more open-minded, they're a bit more progressive in their thinking. Do you find that those are all advantages that play into this as well, as far as being able to cross those bridges?
But I also want to point out that like I was just talking this morning with someone, and what I said is that I do not believe like being young people automatically believe they will be different.
Sure.
I have met many young Chinese people who are as conservative, as not open-minded as many of the people who are much older than them.
Yeah, I see them on the internet.
Yeah. So it's
a lot right now.
And even Chinese people who have been studying in the US, it doesn't mean they are the type of global citizens that we are talking about.
Exactly.
And why?
I feel like
even they are far away from this particular culture.
Do you think the acculturation is so deep that some of those old
what
ways
I would
of thinking
say is
are
that,
really ingrained?
What I would say is that the lack of integration is so common, not only for Chinese companies in Africa, but also for example, Chinese students living and studying in the US as well.
Right.
And there are many reasons with that. Well, language is one issue, but I never believe that's the most important issue, because we know a lot of Chinese who speak very good English, but they're studying in the US and they're still not well integrated into the local society.
Right.
I believe there are many reasons. I feel First, I feel the world that Chinese people have been seeing and knowing is very different than what the world outside has been seeing and knowing.
Yes.
And therefore, it's automatically when you are there, it's not easy for you to go out of the world that you have been seeing and then get into a bigger world.
Right.
And then I feel for many Chinese people, I always say Chinese people, I feel they are smart and they are hardworking. They have many advantages. But in terms of how to do research and how to communicate, I believe that's what Chinese people are not good at internationally.
Yeah. Speaking of communication, I observed that you, I personally like a lot of articles you wrote, and that's why I feel like it's important to convey this message. But in today's world, where most young millennials are living on the social media world, and what they see are kind of like within one particular field, what specific challenge do you see, especially when it comes to sharing their opinion through internet to communicate with the world? Because I feel like it's important to communicate face to face, of course, but not all Chinese young people ready to go global have that advantage.
Well, what I would say is that, so today, sometimes I feel like today many people in China are now talking about China's image internationally. It's not great. We need to do more communication with the outside. We need to tell more China story abroad. But I always feel like there's one very important part that is missing when we're talking about communication. So when we're talking about propaganda, it's one way. It's I want to tell you something. But what we need is not propaganda. What we need is communication. And communication first, before you even speak, you need to learn and you need to ask questions. So you need to learn how to do research.
Right.
And I would say a lot of young Chinese people, they're not very good at that. How to do that research. When you are looking at one information, do you know you need to check other information sources and then you need to have information triangulation? And when you see this on Chinese media, then would you do some Google? And then when you search in Chinese, after that, would you search in English? Because do you know how to ask people questions? When you are seeing people, the foreigners, you have this prejudice against us. Before you do the rebuttal and so on, before you try to debate, before you try to change his mind, did you ask, why do you think that way? And can you tell me why? What's the reason? I feel we haven't been asking enough questions and trying to understand what's going on outside. Only based on those kind of answers and understanding, we can know how to communicate, how to say something.
We actually had a guest a few episodes back, Kelvin, who is working on he has his doctorate, or he's working on his doctorate, but his focus is on like how to learn.
Chinese students to do research.
His mission is exactly this. If you don't already know Kelvin, we should connect you guys. Because
all goes back to education, and it's part of the culture, and of course it's big. But there's a lot of initiatives we can start to help to break that gap. But let me ask one thing. When you are trying to help the Chinese be a global citizen, outside engage with the world, would you also do other work to encourage the world to be more closer to Chinese, or encourage the people who are actually not from the Chinese community to be more proactive in presenting and engaging and teaching, influencing, helping the Chinese to be better integrate in their communities? Like, if there's any.
Well, so I personally believe each organization needs to be focused on something that is really small. So for us, our main focus is really for example, to bring Chinese abroad. We never do people the other way around, like bringing Africans to China. No, and we're not going to do that. Not because that is not important, but because one organization can only do certain things if you want to do it like in a good way. Yeah. So we through our project, we are doing a lot about helping local people understand who the Chinese people are. Because when our young Chinese people are there on the ground, they always do interview with local people. They always interact with the local people. A lot of the time, they live with the local people. And we teach all our young Chinese people, you need to make introduction. You need to speak English. You need to ask questions. And we have actually one requirement to our students that if I put you nearby any strangers, you need to be able to keep asking questions for at least 1 hour without stop. If you cannot do
That's
that,
a good strategy.
you are not going to understand who is this person and what this person is about. So through this, many local people have been telling us that, wow, you guys are the first alive Chinese I have ever talked to. And they are always telling us, wow, like you changed my perception about China and Chinese people.
Okay.
Because like they meet what kind of Chinese people, then this help them understand what is China.
Yeah, and if you record that, then you can have a podcast. That's basically the idea: is have a conversation for an hour and be really engaged and be curious about learning about the other person and what their story is.
Do you have an example to showcase an individual's transformation, if there's any, during this kind of engagement? And what are the conflicts, what are the challenges he or she has to meet, and how is the result?
You mean young Chinese people, right?
Yeah, yes.
Well, there's a lot of like situations. So first, a lot of the young Chinese people, before they go to Africa, they have this perception that it's dangerous, it's dirty, it's chaotic, and so on and so on. And all of them, after being, especially in places like Nairobi, then they will feel, oh, Africa is like this. It's not like that. And at the beginning, they always have this common mistake that like China and Africa, these two countries, they are what. But then they will know Africa is not a country. And Africa is a continent that has over 50 countries. So they get to learn things like this. And I think more importantly, we taught them like how to be open-minded and then try to learn. For example, a lot of young Chinese people, when they go to Africa, they feel like, I'm going there to volunteer. I'm going there to help the local people. And that mindset, I would say, is very problematic.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what many Chinese companies have been doing. They feel like, I'm here to help you. Okay, then if I'm here to help you, you should appreciate us. And then, like, we are doing good.
That's the old colonial mindset that the West has gotten dinged on so hard.
Oh yeah, I know. Like in Belgium, you used to have that in the museum.
Sure.
Belgium brings civilization to Congo.
So what's the best way? The best mindset?
I always tell our young Chinese people, if you go to Africa, if you go to the global south, you are there to learn. You're not there to help. You may be able to help eventually after you learn. So when we bring Chinese people to Africa to do conservation work, it's not to do volunteer. They go there to really understand what is wildlife conservation. They go to understand how like NGOs have been doing wildlife conservation. When they are there to do something about women empowerment, they are not going there to help with local empowerment. They are there to learn about what is NGO and what are these NGOs have been trying to do in terms of to help women empowerment. And then after they learn this, they realize, oh, there's some small thing that we can help, and then they start to help.
So you're starting this as a social enterprise right now, right? And your, I would say, clients or people who actually be interested in this, what are the concerns from those people who, especially the parents, Chinese parents, and how did you actually, in the end, convince them?
Well, actually, talking about clients, we have two kind of clients. One is the young Chinese CPO that we bring out. That is like half of our clients. The other half of our clients, they are actually international organizations, international NGOs and companies. They want to do some project to understand Chinese overseas or to engage them. And then they hire us to do this kind of project. And you will see these two parts, they're actually connected. Because the young Chinese people, when they go abroad, they need projects. And then the projects, they need young Chinese people to do it.
Right.
So it's actually, there's a kind of interconnection there.
Sure.
And for example, Chinese parents, I would say their biggest concern is always security. So I think that's easy to understand. When people decide whether they are going to do something, they look at the benefit and then they look at the cost and the danger.
Right.
And so what we were trying to do is that we will help them understand it's not as dangerous as you would have thought. Like Kenya, now every year there are about 80,000 Chinese tourists visiting Kenya. Tourist country cannot be that dangerous. Otherwise, they will not have tourists. Right. So we help them understand that it's not that dangerous, and we also help the parents understand what will be the benefits. And I always believe when we're doing communication, we need to speak from the perspective of the other side. We need to understand what they care about. So we also help the Chinese parents know, okay, if you do this, this may help with your college application and so on. This may help you become like a better person. We try to speak the language of the parents, not ours, to help them understand there will be some benefits and it's not that dangerous, then you can do it.
When you first were getting into this work and now that you've been in it for a while, I'm curious two things. This is sort of a flip sides of a coin. Question. What was one assumption that you had going in that you were very surprised to find that was wrong? And then what's something you learned that absolutely just changed your thinking with something different?
Well, you're talking about young Chinese going to Africa?
I'm talking about you doing this work and being engaged at the intersection of all this. Yeah, what's an assumption you had about this kind of work and what you were going to find? And then what's something else that you learned that you really want to share with people?
Well, I would say the biggest one is that at the very beginning, when I started to do this research about Chinese companies overseas, it's so easy to stand from an academic perspective and say the Chinese companies, they're wrong. They should do this, they should do that, they should have interaction with the local societies, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. But then, later on, what we realize is that if we spend enough time to understand who are the Chinese companies and why are they doing things this way, then you may find your perception may be totally wrong. And that thing is also something that I want to share, and we share that a lot with international NGOs. It's not just the Chinese companies are ignorant. The NGOs internationally, they're ignorant as well. Mm-hmm. And I think like people usually have this tendency of believing what they believe is everything. And the other side, if they don't believe this way, is ignorant. And I saw this a lot. When at the beginning in Ecuador, when I asked the Chinese companies why the local NGOs are against this project, the Chinese companies told me, oh, they're ignorant. So and that's the same on the other side as well. When I talk with many international NGOs, oh, why some Chinese people buy ivory? Oh, they're ignorant. And then when I talk with some international NGOs doing anti-FGM in Africa, anti-female genital mutilation in Africa, I ask them why there are some people from the tribes that they are educated in the UK and they still support FGM. And then the NGOs say, oh, they're ignorant. I believe that's a totally disastrous answer.
Yeah.
You should never feel that. You should try to understand who are they, why are they doing so, why are they believing so. If you want to engage them, if you want to change them, never feel like they're just ignorant. Try to understand them and try to talk with them, and then you will feel like many things are not the case. For example, Chinese companies, and we usually believe, okay, they do not care about environment, they do not care about society. That's not true.
Right.
There's so many Chinese people in Africa, they're interested in conservation. They just don't know what is that, and they don't know how to participate. There's so many Chinese people in Africa, they want to do charity. And they have been doing charity, but maybe not the way that is greatly appreciated by international society.
So my question is, who can help them? Are the people who can help them are completely from the local stakeholders,
No.
like the NGOs?
No.
Or like they have to bring someone, like train someone from their own people, like this Chinese group, so that they could help them, like translator, for example.
I believe neither way will work. I believe right now the gap is so big between the Chinese companies, Chinese communities, and the outside NGOs and so on.
Can they just talk to each other and sit
Very
down?
difficult.
They need to hire you.
We try many times. We put them in touch. We put the Chinese companies, international NGOs in touch, and put the Chinese companies and the international media in touch. And they have so many issues and conflicts about each other.
What is biggest challenge?
It's so easy to understand. For example, when we connect Chinese companies with Western media, and because Chinese companies do not understand how media work.
Yeah, they're used to thinking they can control the message.
Yeah.
They're used to thinking media equals PR.
Or
Which
they
it's
are feeling
not.
essentially media. If you are our friend, you come here and help us with our propaganda. Or you are our enemy, you come here and write about bad things about
That's
us.
what I'm saying,
And they don't know how to speak with media. They don't know how to tell them this is on the record, this is off the record. They don't know they have the right to verify what they had said. They don't know they can record the conversation as well, just like what the media can do. They don't know this kind of things.
Don't know the possibilities.
Yes, and then
Well,
when the
the
media
parameters,
interview them
so-
and then write something that they don't like, they feel, okay, you are here to spoil us. You are here anti-China, Western media.
Yeah, the concept of journalism is a little
Yeah.
lost, and yeah.
And that's why for us later on, we never put the NGOs and company like directly in touch, because when things goes wrong, they blame us.
Yeah.
So we realized the gap is so huge that there need to be some kind of people who know the both sides and then can be the mediator between the two sides. And they somehow need to be the translator, not language translator,
Right.
but cultural and social system translator.
Right.
They need to be able to tell the Chinese companies, these are the NGOs, these are the media, this is how they work. So when you're interacting with them, this is what you can do, this is what you cannot do. And then you tell the other side to the Chinese.
So if this is a role or a new role, an innovative role that could be established among organizations, enterprises, how do you actually define this kind of role in one line or in few words, like chief diplomat officer or something like
Chief
this?
interpretation
No,
officer,
yeah.
or
I actually believe this would never be a role
does it have to be
inside the
it has to be a
Chinese.
third party of some kind?
I actually believe there will not be this kind of role inside the Chinese company, because in the Chinese company, we need to realize there are many issues that are not directly related but related. For example, the company system. In a Chinese company, you want to do anything on the ground, first get your approval from Beijing. Come on, Beijing is not familiar what's going on. They're on the ground and it's slow. It's so slow. And there will be a lot of these kind of issues there. There was one time we were helping one Chinese company doing a conservation event in Africa, which is a perfect great PR opportunity for them. When it comes to inviting media, first, they cannot invite non-Chinese media because only Chinese media will send them what they are going to write before they publish. The local media will not do that. So the Chinese company decided not to invite non-Chinese media. And then what happened that day is the head of Reuters actually showed up at the gate. And then the Chinese company like, no, you're not on the list. We cannot let you in. We need to first get our approval from Beijing and then we can let you in. Then this guy will be blocked outside. And then this guy will be thinking,
And he's gonna
you must have something to hide.
And he's gonna write a story anyway.
Yes.
And then that's definitely not the story they want.
No.
Yeah.
So what we did is we convinced the Chinese company, please let him enter. We are going to help you talk to this person. We are going to help you understand what he wants to write. And we are going to use our personal connection and so on to help you make sure the story is not going to come out as a bad story. And it's a great story anyway.
Yeah.
So we convinced the head of Chinese company to let him in. Otherwise there would be a PR disaster.
Absolutely.
So I don't believe that role could be inside a Chinese company. It has to be outside.
It has to be someone who has some independent credibility.
Yeah.
And so how do you, my question to follow on this, and Ying sort of touched on this in a different way, but so how do you establishing the credibility is fairly inherent because you're being independent of both sides. But so how do you maintain credibility, and then how do you scale this, because this is a giant topic
and that's a very difficult thing to do, and we spent a lot of time doing so. At the very beginning, when we started, Chinese people say, you must be anti-China Westerners. You're so close with the West. You're westernized. And then when we talk with non-Chinese people, many people say, you must be sent from the Chinese government. You're doing propaganda for the Chinese government. They must have given you a lot of money.
This is that whole thing people can only see from their perspective.
But I think being a bridge is not going to be easy. But that's why there's this kind of necessity to do this.
So how do you do that and maintain credibility, and then how do you scale it?
First, we learn how to speak the language. So we realize when we're talking with Chinese people, we need to use their language. For example, and when we're talking about non-Chinese people NGOs, we need to use their language. For example, when we're doing research about Chinese companies and labor issues in Africa, for the Chinese companies, what we tell them is that we're here to understand how Chinese companies can better handle labor issues. And when we're talking with NGOs, we're telling them we're understanding how Chinese companies should better treat the local laborers so that the local laborers can have better rights and so on. They're both true. They're just saying from different perspectives.
But it's a cultural interpretation that makes the difference. Yeah.
And also, I would say it's like you really try to have empathy. You try to say the things from the other side's perspective. And then credibility on the Chinese side, we rely a lot on Chinese media. So, because what we have been doing, at the beginning, many Chinese people feel like, are we anti-China? Are we westernized? But then they have been seeing what we have been doing, and then see what we do actually have positive impact with China's image overseas. Yeah. And then Chinese media start to put us on CCTV and so on a lot, and that can somehow become like an endorsement from the China side. And when we show that to Chinese companies, they see, if you are on CCTV, you are on Xinhua, you are good people. Then you are fine.
I should put my photos on CCT and CGT, and I should put my photos on the website more prominently.
That's very, very important for Chinese people because they see you on CCTV and Xinhua, they know you are good people. Yeah. And then internationally, apart from speaking from their language, we are also endorsed by many international people like Dr. Jane Goodall. We are endorsed by some kind of Western documentary and so on and so on. And that helps us internationally.
People that have credibility already that they give you by association.
Yes.
In order to make that happen, you really have to work very hard to understand each other, to understand both sides.
Yeah.
Cannot be like one less, one more.
And you need to be able to switch very quickly.
Very quickly.
This moment you are talking with a local human rights NGO. The other moment you're talking about with a Chinese company, the language system switch.
That's exactly what we call cultural intelligence in 21st century. Like when we're trying to help both understand. This is not just about helping Chinese to be equipped with that. It's happening all over the world right now. The world's shifting so much for outside. So let me ask this. For really building the bridges, bring these two sides together to understand each other, which side that you have to spend more efforts in convincing. I understand that you use that way, CGT and other influencer outside to establish credibility. But which side is more difficult in truly to be able to understand that this is very important work?
Or does it just vary case to case?
Well, when I meet Chinese people, Chinese companies, I always tell them they are the most important side. And when I meet international NGOs, I always tell them you are the ones who need to change most. So the real answer is that it's both.
Okay.
So I always feel like it's really both. So when I talk to Chinese people, it's very interesting. When I talk to Chinese people, I always tell them how bad we are internationally and how we should try to understand why people call us like debt trap, neo-colonialism, and so on. And when I'm in international conference, I'm always the China defender. I'm always the one to tell them, no, you need to understand Chinese companies better. Yeah. So I feel like it's important on both sides that China needs to understand outside. Well, that's very easy to understand, but also international NGOs, they should try to understand China better. I still remember a few years ago, we met an international big conservation NGO, and we are proposing to them that we should do a project of engaging Chinese people in Africa, because we know we have this issue of ivory, rhino horn trade, and we know Chinese people in Africa, they are part of this problem. And they're saying, no, the Chinese people can never change. No, the Chinese people, they're criminals. We can never influence them. We should not spend effort to do things like that. So I would really say like, especially since now we're talking for international audience, I would say international audience should spend as much effort to understand China as much as the China side should do. It's not them standing on the moral highland and say it's China who should change. No, that's not true.
With that being said, it's true mission. This true mission of building a bridge is never a one-side job.
No. And there's one time, I still remember, I met an international NGO researcher. He was doing research to understand China in an African country and the local sustainable development. So, of course, in a research, they want to interview Chinese companies. They want to put their voices inside, and it's their obligation to do so because they need to represent diversity of voices. So what they do is they go to Chinese companies, knock on the door and say, according to law of information, you are required to tell me this information. Of course, the Chinese companies kick them out. and when I talked to this guy, and he was like, well, I was doing everything according to the procedure. I requested for information. They refused. So I just write, the Chinese company refused to comment. And I was like, what are you up to? You want a result with different voices, or you want your correct procedure?
Right. Are you looking to confirm your bias?
Yeah.
Or are you looking to actually accomplish something?
If you're having a report about Chinese in Africa and you don't even have the voices of any Chinese in Africa, is your report in any way meaningful at all? I do not think so. And if you want to interview Chinese companies, you need to understand their concern. You need to use their language. And then you realize there's a way that you can engage them and interview them. Now we do research about Chinese companies in Africa and Latin America all the time. There's a way to understand them. If you only want to stick to your Western standard, you may not get what you want. Or maybe that is what you want, some useless reports.
Remember that last time we had a Louis, right? Chris.
Yeah.
And he actually was sitting right here, like where you sit. And he has been an entrepreneur here in China over 11 years, and he studied here, and now he studied his business. Well, actually, we just met, and I feel like every single time I talk with him, and he make his business possible. I make so many friends, so many partners, because he values friendship as far as I see that. But how he make friends here in China is a lot of times more like a Chinese way, make Chinese friends here. And he really knows how to apply that. I think fundamentally, you have a goal, no matter it's a goal to connect with China and, be successful in China, always Chinese people outside of China. Relationship, trust, friendship, do it cross-culturally.
Yeah.
Do it in wherever it works, but focus on making friends.
Yes.
Friendship.
Yes.
Right? I think no matter what way you have to learn, it's all about learning.
Yeah.
And how do you do that? Are you shipping cases of baijiu to Ecuador? Are you?
No, you don't have to.
Are you finding the peace pipe in the jungle and?
No, you don't have to. For example, when we are researching Chinese companies overseas in Africa and so on, first we need to understand who they are and what they are afraid of. And when we meet them, we need to know how to introduce ourselves, how to let them know we are not there to do anything to harm them, and that we are actually not going to do things to harm them. And we use their language to help them understand who we are. And by doing so, you already get a lot of trust. And then we show them like our CCTV reporting, Xinhua and so on. They know who we are. They trust us even more. And when we're interacting with them, we really try to see things from their perspective to understand them. So it's in many details that we can do this.
I would say that for foreigners want to do something here in China, to understand how China works, for Chinese who want to be successful in any country around the world, like Kenya and United States and Brazil, understand how Kenya works, how the United States works, and how Brazil works. And there's so many things from law to local custom practice, education. As long as we understand that, right, the system of this country, it won't be such a big, giant project you cannot break through, right?
Yeah, and it seems like it seems obvious that, I mean, you have to have engaged people on both or all sides if it's a multilateral engagement, and then you have to have someone, in this case, you and your colleagues, to act as that interpretive counsel in a way to help facilitate this. And we sort of talked about it, but I actually want to come back. So in terms of scaling this, we've focused really strongly on the credibility aspect. Other than simply growing your company larger, what are some things that you can suggest to people who perhaps can't engage with you right now, or they're trying to do this in their own part of the world? Maybe they're not even engaged with China specifically, but they're trying to be this similar kind of a bridge in some other context. What are some of the tactics you would suggest to them, strategies and tactics to accomplish what you do, frankly?
Well, I would say the most important thing is to learn, like especially to learn the system that they may not be very familiar with, no matter from the Chinese companies, the Chinese people to understand the NGOs, or the NGOs to understand the Chinese companies. And then equally important, be willing to adjust. Because when we are when we are confronting this kind of like conflicts and issue and difference between two sides, actually sometimes you will find things that you feel it may not really work. And for example, for many NGOs, what they would tell us is that for any companies, even US companies, they're doing the same thing. They investigate and then they send their report and then ask them to comment in 2 weeks. And they sometimes ask me, should we be special to Chinese companies? And they say, listen, we do this all the same to everyone. Should we adjust? And my advice is, yes, you should. If you want to get their voices this way, you will not get their voices, then you should address. For example, in Western journalism standard, when you interview people, I used to have an argument with my professor at Columbia University in journalism school. So according to New York Times and so on, when you are writing a news article, there should be real names. It should not be fake names. And then I was like, I was arguing with one of my professors. So many Chinese people, if you want to quote them, they're not going to talk to you.
Well, it's not a quote. Yeah.
And if they talk to you, they're only to tell you bullshit.
Quote, right.
Yeah. So, and then he said, well, I can always find people who are willing to be quoted. And I said, yes, but then you are never going to get the voices of those who are not willing to be quoted. So for us, when we are doing research, when we are writing articles, for Chinese companies, Chinese people in Africa, always fake names. We don't care whether that's good according to Western journalism.
That's their version of an unnamed source, because that is a tradition, an anonymous source or an unnamed source, but it is a real person. It's really verified, and the journalist and their editor their editors verified this is a real person. This is what they say.
They cannot verify. They cannot, because we are not going to.
I'm saying the Western standard. That's the way an unnamed source works.
So my point is that there are many things that we have to be able to willing to address, instead of just saying this has been the way that we have been doing it. No. You adjust.
Yeah. Again, that goes back to our cultural lesson about for the Chinese culture of, according to Confucianism, actually, the 枪打出头鸟, the nail stick out will be cut, and the bird get out will get shot. And this kind of thing is pretty easy to understand. But as we go global, sometimes we have to have our head, sometimes to be, on the top. We have to take the lead. We have to not be afraid of showcasing who we are, right? How to encourage a lot more and more Chinese when they're going global? They have to speak, they have to talk, they have to share. Like when they share, do you encourage them more according to the Western standard, which actually speak out a lot of things, or you kind of want them to maintain themselves?
No. When we are always telling, even you are the same person, when you're speaking with different people, you are different. So I always tell them that, like Chinese companies, that you have to speak when media come to you and NGOs come to you. Otherwise, they are going to have a reporting and say NGO A say this, the workers say this, the union say this, and the Chinese company refuse to comment.
Right.
Which is even worse for you.
Yeah.
Right.
So you speak, the story is not going to go as what you wish it to be, but it's going to be better in most of the cases, not all of the cases. So therefore, when Chinese companies are interacting with NGOs, with media, they also need to be careful. They need to know the technique in doing so. But they do have to speak.
But they have to speak authentically and honestly,
and they need to
such as they, and there are always trade secrets or things that you don't reveal that are part of your internal business. But what you say needs to be legitimate as much as
So you need to be able to say something, and not just reading our statement, but really having conversation, communication. Say the human words. That's human language. That's what I always say, instead of the propaganda language. That doesn't work. That's not interesting for media. As a journalist, I know I'm not going to quote the propaganda statement.
Oh, absolutely. Well,
give them something to quote.
And look, and coming from Hollywood, and being used to seeing, like, whenever somebody is fired from a show, creative differences. We were going in a different direction. And meanwhile, you talk to people who were in the know. It's like, they hated each other. And here's why.
Yeah.
And but there's the public facade of that, and so that PR talk, people in the know just roll their eyes. But if you're not close enough to the situation to understand, you might accept that as reality. And ultimately, the idea is that you're not getting real learning out of this.
Oh, yeah.
You're not actually. So it seems like the best and probably most obvious advice is that say both sides have to come correct, as the kids would say in the West. They have to show up fully and honestly, and they have to be committed to achieving the goal. Would you say? More than protecting their face, in a sense, they have to be willing to you have to bend. Yeah, people can't see my visual metaphor, but I have my hands together by the palms, and if one side does all the leaning, that's not precarious. But if you meet in the middle, that's a hard.
Yeah,
that's why you're showcasing us what it means to be average and how can we achieve it. Address that. I like the word you mentioned because action speaks louder. Right? So what are your future plans with China House, Zhongnanwu, and in terms of vision and address new challenges and your hope for how far it can go?
So I always try to use a comparison which may not be very accurate because it's different in many cases. But I always say I wish China House to become essentially China's version of Peace Corps. So sending young Chinese people abroad, and through this there could be several things that could be achieved. One, young Chinese people going to the world and try to do something that is good for the world, not good for China, but good for the local communities. No matter when we're talking about wildlife conservation, we're talking about community development and so on. So it's like Chinese people helping the world become better. And the second objective that can be achieved from that is that through these young Chinese people, many local people and international people, they would change their perception about China because of the Chinese people they have met and the things that these young Chinese people have been doing. This will actually help China have a better global image overseas. And the last part is that through this kind of experience and training, we believe these young Chinese people will become a kind of generation of what I would call Chinese global citizens. They are Chinese, they understand the China side, and they are more global citizens, and they are understanding what's going on internationally. So this kind of young Chinese people in future, when they get into Chinese companies, get into NGOs and media and so on, they can create more bridge internationally. And with all this kind of young Chinese people, so what we wish to do is in future, on one hand, encourage more young Chinese people to go to the global south through us. On the other hand, we wish to work with more international NGOs, research organizations, and so on, and using the young Chinese people that we have to help them do research and projects to understand and engage Chinese communities overseas, in Africa, Latin America, the global south.
Very nice.
That's probably the best way to summarize our show. I would say, given time, the world will have more hope to see a China like this, and China will have more real opportunity to connect.
Yeah.
Absolutely. How can we'll put this in the show notes as well, but how should people find out more about you? Where should they find you online and such?
Well, we do have a website that is not very mature yet. It's called globalchinahouse.org. Okay. And then people can also find us on Facebook, China House Kenya. And then people can always find me on LinkedIn and so on and so on.
We'll keep in touch with you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Hong. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the show this week. Don't forget to visit HowChinaWorksPodcast.com where you can find out more about us. You can reach out and contact us with any notes or suggestions or tips. Please share, rate, subscribe, and review the show in your favorite podcatcher if you like it. Thanks again for listening. On behalf of Yingling Li, I'm Brendan Davis, and we'll see you next week on How China Works.